Welcome to this episode of the Partovi Effect. My name is Mrs. Madi Partovi,
And I'm Dr. Ryan Partovi.
and we're going in with the serious conversation. Okay. You had shared a graph on your Facebook page.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's figure one from the autism and vaccination episodes that we've done recently.
Yeah. So US autism prevalence versus vaccine schedule expansion from 1980 to 2020. All right. And then we had a comment from Miss Meredith. Now, let's see one. Adding in the data for reduced infant mortality rates due to vaccines, but you might need to rescale your graph 10 times. I detect a hint of snarkiness in that comment, but we're going to address it level-headed. Okay?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So I think that the implication there is basically that, okay, vaccines may have contributed to increased risk in autism and increased rates of autism, but if we were to do the inverse, which is to eliminate vaccination, then we'd see a really huge spike in infant mortality. First of all, I want to just create a little bit of background context before I even get into addressing the question of childhood mortality and how that would be affected by vaccination, a pause in vaccination, let's say. I'm not advocating for the end of vaccination as a concept. I think what we need vaccination that's, number one, smart, which is not the same schedule for everyone. It needs to be customized and individualized, personalized. Number two, we need to get out the toxic components. There shouldn't be any aluminum in vaccines. There shouldn't be things that we know have toxicity, and especially if we know that they bioaccumulate, they accumulate in the body over time. We shouldn't be putting those into childhood vaccinations. And they should be administered in a way that triggers the natural kind of immune response, which is that IgA immune response, IgA is the immunoglobulin, the antibody that's produced in our mucous membranes, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, anus, for that matter, and also vaginal and penile reproductive areas. That area has what's called the mucosal-associated lymphatic tissue, the MALT, and that mucosa is where most of our IgA, and also lining our gut, is where most of that IgA is produced. That's where the vast majority of viruses and bacteria are going to enter the body, and that's where we need to put our immune response. How much sense does it make to create this massive IgG response, which is what you get when you bypass all that, and you inject an antigen directly into the body? You get a really strong IgG response, which is like the immune response against something that's already breached the barriers, right? It's already gotten past the wall. It's already gotten past the mucosa. It's already into the bloodstream, into the tissues. And now you've got a real systemic problem. That doesn't really even make much sense to me as a way to protect us against infection from transmission, right? Which is the putative stated goal of vaccination, which is to reduce transmission. If you're going to do that, you need a strong IgA response. And you need a strong mucosal response. And probably the best way to do that is going to be with some of the newer vaccine technologies that are actually like nasal sprays or oral, right? Where you're actually getting exposed to it through the same way that you would a virus or a bacteria. But I think before we can even have that conversation, we need to have a conversation about what are the potential benefits of natural infection that we may be missing out on, which we saw a lot of that in the measles conversation, where we saw 25% reduction in risk of cardiovascular event death from natural measles infection, where we saw from chickenpox, natural chickenpox infection, 60% reduction in glioma risk, right? We saw at least, I think it was a 20% reduction in all-cause cancer from ages 15 to 65 in people who had natural measles infections. So the first question is, because we know that high rates of vaccination minimize transmission, certainly of these childhood illnesses. But the question is the juice worth the squeeze? So if, for example, nobody's getting measles anymore, is there any, for example, any benefit on all-cause mortality from the vaccines? Number one. And number two, are we seeing, is the benefit, if there is a benefit, is that benefit the same or greater than just getting the natural infection, right? Because if getting the natural infection is greater, which is what I suspect might be the case, then our focus should be on optimizing the terrain, optimizing the MALT, the mucosal-associated lymphatic tissue, that IgA response, to protect the body as much as possible so that we can have a robust response, so that you never even get close to the point where the person's life is threatened. And I think if we do that by focusing on terrain and boosting immunity and early treatment, then I think we've really we get the best of both worlds in that case. We get the natural infection and all of the side benefits of that, plus we get a very low risk of morbidity and mortality. So getting into the question that, did you have anything you want to say about that before I got into the specific question of infant mortality?
It makes so much sense to me as a mom and as the first line choice maker and protection of my children.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks for saying that, because it's not just because it's validating, but also because our goal here is really to create a new consensus for humanity. And I think that this is an important part of the conversation. It's not about some reactionary knee-jerk, let's get rid of all vaccines forever and ever, amen. But how can we make vaccines safer? How can we provide informed consent? How can we make them even more effective? These are questions that we really need to ask. And when are they appropriate and when may they not be appropriate? And the answer is, there may be certain people, certain children that they are appropriate for and others that they're not. And that's okay. It's okay in a world where vaccine choices are being driven by science and medicine and individualized, personalized care versus the bottom line of the vaccine manufacturers, which is the current state of affairs, right?
Yes. And what if that law changed? What if these pharmaceutical companies were liable for injury and for death?
Right.
Like,
Well,
how would things change then?
yeah, I think you'd get a lot safer vaccines, first of all, and maybe fewer, which may be okay, because the idea would be only if it's truly safe and effective would we even allow it to come out, right? And I think if we let the market decide these things, I think that if there's clear data that everybody agrees is unimpeachable, then why would that not be something that everyone gets on board with? It just seems to make sense to me. I don't really understand why anybody would. If the science is solid, if the science is there, it's done in an impeccable, unimpeachable way, and showing that the vaccines that would then emerge from such a system are truly safe and effective. You may still have a few people that are holding out, but I think that by and large, you'd see a lot less vaccine skepticism. And frankly, I think you'd see a lot fewer vaccine injuries as well. So it'd be a win-win. But industries exist to make profit for their shareholders. Let's just be straight about that. Their goal is not to optimize your health and well-being as an individual. Their goal is to make money. And so this is the main reason why, if I were made president tomorrow, I would socialize the entire industry. I don't think it makes sense to have a for-profit industry that is tasked with the health and well-being of the populace. That doesn't make sense to me, because it's not going to be profitable to provide what is in the best interests of people's health. It will be profitable to give people what they want, potentially, and you could get closer to that. You could approximate that with a true free market system, which is what the conservative, very technocratic, highly intellectual conservative economists will say. Like, well, if we had a true free market, which, by the way, you can't have a true free market without regulation, because regulation prevents cronyism. Regulation prevents companies from colluding together to push out competitors, to take over the market, to take over the regulatory agencies, to take over the government with contributions, such that then they can do whatever they want, right? So you need strong regulation to ensure free markets, which is one of the things that people often misunderstand about the nature of free markets. And even, I would say, most conservative economists misunderstand about regulation and about free markets, is that the goal of regulation is actually to ensure a free market. But anyway, I think that, to me, the pharmaceutical industry has proven it cannot be trusted. We've given it 100 years to prove that we're wrong. And consistently, it's proved that we're right, that they are fundamentally corrupt and corrupted by that profit motive, and they're not truly willing to set aside that and work for the people. And I think the only way that's ever going to happen is if we just remove profit from the equation. That's my opinion. Obviously, you feel free to disagree, but I think that, and not that there's not corruption in nonprofits, right? And not that there's not corruption in government, because of course it's rampant, right? But I think that the degree to which people's lives and health have been, that profit has been put over people's lives and health is criminal. So that's my view.
And I think
Anything
that's
you want to
really,
say
I
about
think that I think especially after what happened from 2020 on, still happening. There are still institutions of schooling that require the COVID vaccination and booster. That is so criminal given the evidence that we have.
Yeah.
Okay, I think especially after what happened during COVID, it's lifted the veil for a lot more people, like people that trusted authority, that trusted their pediatricians and their doctors. People are starting to ask questions.
Yeah. Well, and I think that they should be. And I think that I just want to clarify one thing, which is that the first thing a lot of people are going to say when they hear socialize the pharmaceutical industry is they're going to think, oh, so now you're going to put it in control of the corrupt government. And it's like, no, because my ideal hypothetical was when I'm in control. If I were in control, like, so the point is that if I were in control, I would be rooting out the corruption anywhere and everywhere I see it, such that it wouldn't be a corrupt government that would be controlling the production of pharmaceuticals. It would be a government that has multiple redundant internal mechanisms to reduce and prevent corruption as much as humanly possible. And you're never going to get to 100%. I'm not a utopian, but I do think that you can shoot for 100% and you can approximate it, right? And that's the goal fundamentally of that whole endeavor of human progress. Right?
Yeah. Speaking of human progress and shooting for that 100%, I just want to take a moment to celebrate the nomination of Dr. Casey Means, the U.S. Surgeon General.
That is promising. That is promising. I'm curious to see what she's able to accomplish. So
yeah,
hopeful.
One of my favorite moments when she said that I learned nothing at Stanford University about nutrition.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. Thank you for being so straight.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, higher education right now in general has become so algorithmic and so profit driven, even to the point where I remember even during the 2010s, there was the movement to like, let's collect data on the average income of the graduates of a university and make that data public. And look, I'm all for making data public, and I have no problem with that idea as a concept. But my problem with it is it focuses on the wrong thing. It's like, well, let's focus on how much money you're able to make with this degree, how much monetary value this degree has, versus like, what kind of people are these institutions producing? Are these people ethical, right? Are they moral people? Are they living ethical, moral lives, contributing to society, making a real difference in the lives of others, making the world a better place? Or are they making more money for the bottom line of some Wall Street company?
Or fundamentally, does it provide these people with a sense of self-fulfillment and happiness?
Right. Well-being.
Oh my
yeah.
gosh, and
right?
well-being.
Yeah.
Mental well-being.
Absolutely. Yeah. That to me, you want to talk about outcomes. That's the fundamental outcome that you want. When I was having this conversation this week with some friends of ours who are visiting us about Montessori education. It's like, to me, it's not just Montessori is able to produce in 6 years of Montessori school an extra year of academic performance. So on average, graduates of 6 years in Montessori school have basically have the equivalent academic performance as someone who's been in school, traditional school, for 7 years, right? That's on average. So it's also the fact that when you do the longitudinal studies, and again, this is based on a meta-analysis of, I think, 32 studies, you also see tremendous significant improvements in versus baseline versus public school, just generic traditional schooling. And there are great public Montessori schools, so I wanted to clarify that. But on well-being, on mental health, like statistically significant reductions in mental illness, mental disease, mental disorders of any kind, including more mild ones that people struggle with on a daily basis, anxiety, depression, the most common ones.
And
Just
skyrocketing ones.
Yeah, and just like general satisfaction with life is far superior amongst graduates of Montessori programs. So it's really, that's the kind of outcomes that we should care about when you're looking at university, when you're looking at any educational program. To me, I care about outcomes, not just academic outcomes, but also not just mental health, or not just mental performance, but also mental health and emotional health, right? And frankly, spiritual health for that matter. So, yeah. All right. You ready for this?
I am.
All right. What would happen to life expectancy if we just paused childhood vaccines tomorrow? And my view is ultimately not a whole lot, because I think you may even actually get a slight improvement in long-term all-cause mortality with, at most, a marginal increase in childhood mortality amongst children with, again, complex chronic conditions. The only kind of children we saw, for example, who died from COVID were ones with complex chronic diseases, multiple comorbidities, and who had those and then delayed medical treatment. So it's usually like there's a 1-2 punch, right? It's like you had something pre-existing and then you waited to get care, right? Or you got the wrong kind of care, which is a whole other issue during COVID, which we've covered quite a bit. So first, I would say the question I think most people are going to be asking is, why would childhood mortality not skyrocket? And for that, you have to get a little bit into the history. You have to get into the claim that is made by the mainstream public health officials that vaccines single-handedly saved humanity from deadly childhood illnesses, which really ignores that historical trend that we've talked a little bit about, but I mention again now, in disease mortality. Mortality from diseases like measles, polio, diphtheria, whooping cough had already plummeted. Plummeted, really, like if you look at some of the graphs, it's dramatic. It's like this, to the point where it's like less than 0.1%, less than, in the case of measles, it was 0.01% before the respective vaccines were introduced. And this was due primarily to improvements in sanitation. You had clean drinking water, toilets that flush water down and basically clean themselves to some degree, almost. Sewage that is kept away from society versus like horse poop filling the streets a few decades before, right? And huge nutritional advancements, especially vitamin A and vitamin D, which are crucial for immunity, right? And getting enough protein, which is so dramatically important for young people, especially for immune function, but really even just for final adult height and mental health and any number of other things, certainly for immunity. And then again, general improvements in medical care and access to antibiotics. So let's take the example of a few of these. Measles, as I mentioned, in the United States, mortality was near zero before 1963 when the vaccine was introduced. Polio outbreaks, we've not talked a ton about this, but it's really fascinating. I really recommend the book, The Moth and the Iron Lung. Polio outbreaks corresponded suspiciously well to the introduction and spread of neurotoxic pesticides. For example, the initial outbreak was strongly associated with the beginning of the use of lead arsenic and then later DDT. And the idea is not, it wasn't really polio, it was these pesticides. That's not what we're claiming. The idea here is that the pesticides made both the gut barrier as well as the blood-brain barrier more porous, more susceptible to the polio virus in a way that it hadn't been prior to the introduction of these pesticides. So if you learn about it, you'll find out exactly what I just said, that polio virus had been around for a long time, hadn't really been causing poliomyelitis until we see the introduction of these pesticides. So it's pretty fascinating. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I highly recommend that rabbit hole. Diphtheria and pertussis, part of the Tdap, or what used to be called the DAP vaccine, both bacterial infections. So again, as long as you get treated early, they respond beautifully to antibiotics. Same with Haemophilus influenza B. Same with the bacteria that causes meningitis, which is Streptococcus meningitidis, I believe. I hope I'm saying that right. Anyway, all of these respond beautifully to antibiotics, which in my view really should make vaccines for them obsolete. So, there's also this hypothesis which we learn about in school, which is the natural infection hypothesis. And we've talked a little bit about that in the measles episode, where exposure to these diseases builds long-term immunity, which then has secondary future protective benefits, right? So measles exposure, we've talked about how it's correlated with the reduced risk of cancers, especially in 15 to 65 age range, because of the way it modulates the immune response. And basically, we think it probably helps the body find and fight cancer more easily. Natural chickenpox infection, we've talked about how that can reduce not only the risk of shingles, and getting re-exposed to it reduces your risk of getting shingles as an adult, but also reduces your glioma risk. I already mentioned that, but the vaccine-induced immunity wanes, and then you either have to get a booster or you have to ideally get exposed to someone who's got shingles or has chickenpox. And then breastfed infants of measles recovered mothers actually get strong natural passive immunity, which is far more protective than vaccine-induced immunity. And so what's interesting about that is if we, instead of encouraging early childhood vaccination with aluminum-containing vaccines, promoted prolonged breastfeeding and gave women the space and the accommodation and the remuneration, perhaps, to focus on that, I think the long-term beneficial effects on society would be profound. So, and then I also think that there's also just people who, for whatever reason, biological or logistical, have struggled with that. And I think we need to encourage more milk banks and milk banking and the availability of breast milk, because even if you're not getting it from your own mother, it's still better than any kind of formula that exists. And there are milk banks, but there should be more, and it should be more readily available. So for all those reasons, it doesn't check out to me, this idea that removing childhood vaccinations are going to result in some deadly wave of childhood deaths. Instead, it's more likely that it will restore the natural order of stronger lifelong immunity, and quite likely improving all-cause mortality over the entire lifespan. Now, and I wanted to add to that a funny statistic that I heard this morning. I was listening to a podcast with Ryan. It might have been a Rogan episode, but the claim was made that it was just shy of 4%, but I'm going to round up to 4%, that only 4% of the life expectancy improvements that have occurred over the last century can be directly attributed to medical advancements. Doctors, basically. So I said to him, son, if I and the rest of all the doctors disappeared tomorrow, we may lose 4 out of every 100 people. But at the end of the day, it's like tragic deaths for sure, but like not a ton, really. Not a ton. And that's over the entire lifespan, not just looking at childhood. So I don't want to diminish that it would be a lot of people, but it wouldn't be, as a percentage of the overall population, it would still be pretty small for as much credit as we give modern medicine for saving so many people's lives. It's really, we say 4%.
Wait, and really, how much credit are we giving modern medicine when the state of America's health is the way that it is?
Well, that's a very good counter argument, which is to say, okay, but that 4% that are being saved by antibiotics and surgery, how many people, by having a system that depends on drugs and surgery as the form of medicine, have we actually doomed to chronic disease? You could make an argument a lot more than 4%, right? Probably closer to 60% plus, right? And that is fantastic pushback. So I like that. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit about how is it that we really can control infectious disease? Obviously, it's not just through vaccines. But did you have anything else you wanted to say before that?
No.
Okay. So we've talked in the vaccine space, there's a lot of talk about herd immunity. And herd immunity, I got to be honest with you, it's largely a pharmaceutical industry talking point rather than some law of science. Because if the vaccines truly created herd immunity, we'd see a few things. First of all, the COVID-19 vaccine should have stopped viral transmission. Instead, we saw widespread outbreaks in highly vaccinated populations. And now we actually have evidence that receiving the COVID vaccine prolongs viral clearance on average. And the more doses of the COVID vaccine that you got, the longer the time to viral clearance is. So the longer that the virus stays in your system, the more virus you get exposed to, the more spike protein you get exposed to, which actually increases your risk of long COVID. But if herd immunity was a thing, why would that be the case? The next thing I wanted to bring up was that the famous Disneyland measles outbreak occurred in a fully vaccinated population. So, what happened there? Pertussis outbreaks routinely occur in highly vaccinated populations, which again should bring the question, if you're paying attention, of whether the pertussis vaccine actually may increase susceptibility to colonization by non-pertussis Bordetella species. So there could be Bordetella species that are not Bordetella pertussis, but they're adjacent, and maybe we're more susceptible to those, and those can still create the same symptoms, where you have the same kind of pertussis-like symptoms, but maybe it's not the Bordetella pertussis bacteria itself, but a closely related bacteria that's causing those symptoms. So maybe we blocked off one type of Bordetella bacteria, but opened ourselves up to other ones because we've created a strong immune response to one. So we have selective immunity to that one, but maybe opening some other one. So that's been an interesting area of inquiry. So what ultimately does reduce transmission? Number one, optimize vitamin D levels. We've talked some about that, but it's crucial for immune function, especially in the winter. In fact, there's a great interview with a couple of vitamin D researchers with Brett Weinstein on his podcast, the Dark Horse podcast, where they talk about how really it's not so much cold, flu, and COVID season, but rather it's vitamin D deficiency season. And I think I don't think that's the full picture, but I definitely think that is part of the picture. Number two, proper nutrition. Right? Especially reducing refined sugars, added sugars, ultra-processed foods, pesticides, hormones, antibiotics. Those are the low-hanging fruit, right? Hand washing, but again, not with antibiotic soaps, because antibiotic soaps actually increase what? Do you remember?
Ask the question again.
Antibiotic soaps. What's wrong with antibiotic soaps?
Oh, they strip all the healthy good bacteria
Right. Yeah.
from.
Yeah. Which then increases the likelihood that you're going to have antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? So it actually perpetuates the problem of antibiotic resistance. Also, most of the bacterial removal that comes from soap comes from the actual surfactant capability of the soap, which is a perfect segue to number four, avoiding unnecessary antibiotics, which of course damage the gut flora and impair immune function. And number five, when you have symptoms, it is kind to mask, right? So that you're not coughing all over everyone. Now, what I would say is make sure you're wearing a cloth mask, which you may say, but Dr. Partovi, you've told us that cloth masks don't work. Cloth masks do not work to protect you from illness, but they do reduce your risk of spreading it when you're coughing and sneezing and blowing your nose, right? The problem with medical masks is that we know that some of the components of them, and I believe it's the phthalates, increase your lifetime risk of lung cancer. So that's why I try to minimize my use of medical masks, because I think that they have long-term negative effects, which I'm not in favor of. But if you have symptoms, it makes a lot of sense to wear cloth masks. In fact, if I had been in charge, Grand Poobah at the beginning of COVID, knowing the WHO data on masks, this is what I would have said. I would have said, look, if you have symptoms, please wear a mask. If you don't have symptoms, don't worry about it. I think that would have probably saved a lot of people's lives and money and businesses and everything else in between. But yeah, masking, as we have seen, provides minimal benefit in real world scenarios. So my call to the public health folks was, if you really care about reducing disease burden, you should be advocating for these evidence-based health interventions instead of pushing admittedly liability-free, but pharmaceutical products, which the liability-free piece is like, surely you should be skeptical of that. It's like, okay, maybe we should think 3 or 4 times before we start advocating for liability-free products that these companies are not going to be held liable for if they hurt people, before we start pushing those things.
Yeah, I have a little movie going on in my head while you speak,
Go
where
ahead.
you were talking about masks. Shame on you, Costco and Sprouts, for kicking a 8-month pregnant woman out of your store for not wearing a mask. That was me in 2021.
Yeah. Well, that's absurd. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, what is it that they were afraid that you were going to spread? If you don't have symptoms, there's really no risk to anyone else of you not wearing a mask. The only risk from someone not wearing a mask is if they do have symptoms. And that's why it is polite to wear a mask or just stay home if you do have symptoms. But if you have to go out, if you have symptoms, wear a nice cloth mask. Yeah, I'm sorry that happened too.
Mm.
Have a little drink here. So, what about long-term health complications? What if people were getting more of these childhood illnesses? Wouldn't there be more long-term complications, you might ask? And here's the problem with that. Modern vaccines are strongly associated with an increase in allergic, autoimmune, as well as neurodevelopmental disorders. The only study in the United States that has ever looked at vaccinated children against unvaccinated children, which got such a dog pile that they ultimately retracted it. But it's like, why did they retract it? Why did it get dogpiled? Well, because it threatened a multi-billion-dollar vaccine industry, obviously. Why is that the only study? If that was such a horrible study, why hasn't it been replicated 12 times to show us how obviously a correct study should be done to evaluate this question? Well, gee, maybe because nobody wants that study done. But that study showed clear, significant increase in neurodevelopmental disorders in the children that were fully vaccinated versus the ones that were unvaccinated. I forget what the multiplier was, but it was definitely statistically significant and strongly so. And then there was I think it was a Swiss study actually that I remember reading when I was in school that showed, again, looking at unvaccinated versus vaccinated groups of kids. And the unvaccinated group had far lower levels of allergies, asthma, eczema, any kind of atopic condition, autoimmunity compared to the fully vaccinated group. We know that autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes, which often the childhood onset of that is within a year or so of the big round of vaccines that kids get around age 4. Kids usually get the vaccines, that big round, prior to kindergarten, between 4 and 6. And we see the onset of childhood diabetes, type 1 diabetes. There's a big spike between like 5 and 7. That's in the year or so after that big round of vaccines. Coincidence, maybe, but I think that if you understand the way vaccines work and understand the way molecular mimicry works and how it gets triggered by the vaccine antigens, and even if it's not the antigens themselves, even if it's the the adjuvants that are going along with these antigens, which then are sensitizing us to other proteins in our environment, other antigens from either our food or from other environmental exposures, pollen, et cetera. And then those are the things that are leading to the increased risk of type 1 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis and juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, things like that. And even in adults, we see multiple sclerosis, MS, associated with that molecular mimicry phenomenon that we know is induced by vaccine antigens and adjuvants together. I think that it's another indication of why we would see long-term health complications decrease if we didn't have the vaccines, or at least not the ones we have now, right? Neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism, I would say probably especially autism, but definitely watch our two-part autism expose on that, have shown a very troubling association with vaccination. And that's been in studies, like I said, that have been aggressively suppressed. So cancer is the big question mark. We don't really know the full extent, but it's very possible that the immune dysregulation caused by that excessive immune stimulation that you're getting from vaccination could be contributing to rising cancer rates. It's also possible that not being able to get the natural infections, like we dealt with we talked about that in the measles episode extensively, that not having that natural infection could actually also be contributing to that immune dysregulation, because you don't actually have the opportunity to tone and season and develop the immune system. And so then it gets distracted reacting to all these allergies, and you see this crazy spike in allergies, which I remember allergies are Th2 response. And we see that there's this strong Th2 response, and our immune system has two main modes, right? Th1, Th2. Th1, viruses and cancer, right? Th2, bacteria and allergies. Which do you think people struggle more with these days, right? They have allergies constantly, so you get this overactivation of Th2. Meanwhile, people are struggling when it comes to turning back to the Th1 to deal with viruses and cancer. We haven't seen a deadly bacterial plague recently. Wonder why? It's not just antibiotics, I promise you. It's because our immune system is already hanging out over there in Th2 land. But we have seen increased rates of problematic viruses as well as problematic cancers. And I think that there is a plausible biological mechanism linking vaccination to that phenomena. Meanwhile, so we've talked about natural infections. We've talked about how they can prime and strengthen the immune system in ways that this artificial vaccination can't do. Polio, as I mentioned before, or I alluded to before, is really not an issue if we just eliminate lead, arsenic, pesticides, and DDT, which we've done, except incidentally in like the only area of the world where there's still polio, which is in Africa, where they're still using DDT. So yeah, the real causes, the fundamental underlying causes of many of these modern illnesses, these diseases, is not actually the infection, but it's the lifestyle that creates that terrain that gives the infection an opportunity to pop up and cause a problem. It's the immune dysregulation that's created by industrial toxins, including pesticides, processed food, the 10,000 different food ingredients that were allowed in this country versus 400 in Europe. It's just absurd. And then, of course, the pharmaceuticals, including the vaccination. This is really what's underlying the modern chronic disease epidemic. And I think that people are becoming more and more aware of this. And I think that's fantastic. I'm excited about it. But anything you want to say at this point?
No, I had a bit of a monkey mind, or I was a bit distracted when we were talking about the soaps. But I did want to share that we are very intentional about what kinds of soaps that our family uses. And the boys are trained not to use all those hand sanitizers that exist everywhere in every establishment. Yeah, with triclosan in them.
Yeah. Not exactly the cleanest ingredients, right? You can make your own hand sanitizer with like literally essential oils and alcohol spray. The safest way to do it. Just put some 70+% alcohol, isopropyl alcohol with some essential oil, maybe some grapefruit seed extract. And
grapefruit is my favorite. Can you use lemon? Can you use
just mix that up, spray it on your hands, rub it together. There you go. It's better than any of those commercial products. Yeah. So then, of course, the question that always gets brought up is like, well, if we eliminated vaccines, it's going to overwhelm the healthcare system, which, of course, is based on a lot of faulty assumptions. The first one, which I think is huge, is this idea that, oh, vaccines are just super, super effective. They're as effective as the people that are selling them claim that they are, which I think there's considerable evidence now. We've talked about COVID, we talked about the measles, we talked about pertussis, whooping cough. I think there's mounting evidence that they're not as effective as the manufacturers claim them to be. It's also based on, again, the second incorrect assumption is that they significantly reduce disease burden, which again remains unproven. There's no clear indication, except I would say there's some studies out of third world countries where there's a lot of nutrient deficiency. And I haven't had a chance to take a look at those. There's some physicians that I trust that I've heard, they say, well, even if you really delve into those studies, there's questions that remain unasked. And I'm not so sure that the argument of like, well, if you're nutrient deficient, maybe the vaccine is going to help you more than it's going to hurt you. I haven't looked in that, so I'm still open to being persuaded one way or the other on that for sure. I'm still pretty open to being persuaded on anything if somebody comes with enough evidence that I can validate one way or the other. But the trouble is like people say stuff like, oh, all of the vaccines were subject to pre-licensing safety trials. And then you read the safety trial. It's like, wait a second, the placebo is not sodium chloride in a syringe. The placebo was the vehicle, like literally all the ingredients of the vaccine minus the antigen that they're wanting to vaccinate you with. So all the toxicity of the vehicle was in the placebo. That's not a placebo, right? So placebo has to be inert, has to have no biological effects. Obviously, that's hard to do in an injection, but the closest you're probably going to get is saline. So that's what they should be doing, but they're not. And then the third faulty assumption is that modern medicine can't handle infectious diseases, which I think is just patently absurd. I think that modern medicine, when it's allowed to work the way it's supposed to work, in other words, where it's not top down dictated by the government, this is the protocol you must use. And if you do anything else, then you're anti-science, right? Which is what they did during COVID. If they allow doctors to be doctors, right? The famous slogan that Dr. Corey and Dr. Merrick said during COVID is like, let doctors be doctors. Just let us do our thing. And we can handle pretty much any infectious disease. So look, especially these diseases like measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, already super well controlled prior to mass vaccination. And there's really no compelling evidence whatsoever that suspending vaccination would create mass outbreaks. If that were the case, then the question would be to ask, okay, well, where are these examples of large-scale outbreaks occurring in modern, well-nourished, high sanitation populations when vaccines have been temporarily unavailable? And then again, the converse of that is what I said a minute ago about one of the few places where polio still is a problem in Africa are places that are still using DDT. So this idea that wild polio is still a culprit, I think is just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And then finally, just addressing life expectancy for a minute. This whole life expectancy argument, looking at life expectancy in the early 1900s, is based on a false premise. And that false premise is that it was just because of infectious disease, and that's just not correct. Life expectancy in the early 1900s was not low purely because of infectious disease alone. It was low because you had high infant mortality, which was due to poor sanitation and malnutrition. And that dramatically skewed the averages. The other thing to keep in mind is medical care for any kind of chronic condition was significantly less advanced. And on top of both of those things, you had workplace and environmental hazards that are far greater. Sanitation, nutrition, general medical care improvements have done the lion's share of the work in extending life expectancy. Vaccines, frankly, were simply along for the ride. So this claim that you'll hear that, oh, if we eliminated vaccines, we would immediately lose 5 to 10 years off of our life expectancy is just, I mean, at best, it's pure speculation with zero real world evidence to support it. At worst, you have to start wondering about, okay, well, but follow the money, right? What is the profit motive of the people saying that? So my view, and I think you would probably agree with me, is that the true drivers of long-term health and lifespan are nutrition, sanitation, avoidance of toxic exposures.
I do agree with you because I'm sitting here making facial expressions.
Yeah. And those probably, the facial expressions are, say more about that. Their facial expressions to agree with me.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. I thought you were like exercising your face, or like you were going to say something about like, well, what about mental health and well-being and that impact on lifespan, which I would agree with, by the way.
Yes.
It's certainly not this, again, pharmaceutical industry's liability-free products. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Liability-free. These are products that they have no liability for if they put toxins in them, if they poison people, if they kill people. There's no coming for them. We have given them a statutory pass, a free pass, which is insane. So please join me in writing your congresspeople, writing your senators, begging them to revoke this law that was passed.
And the things that you can immediately do, out of the gates, question your pediatrician. There's this mom that's in my sphere.
Or find a new one.
Or find a new one.
Probably. If they're trying to push the standard CDC schedule on you, find a new one. But go ahead.
There's this mom in my sphere that asked her pediatrician what the ingredients were in this particular vaccine that she was wanting, like, fear mongering and pushing on her baby, her 6-month-old baby. Pediatrician could not answer the question and said, you're going to find more toxic things in food supply, so you may as well get her vaccinated.
Well, a few problems with that. First of all, there's a big difference with, so then I would say, all right, well, here, let me shoot this vaccine over your food, doc, and then you eat it, right? If that's what you want to, if that's the claim you want to make, which is fine. It's like, hey, you want to do that? That's great. Personally, I like to keep the aluminum away from my food whenever possible. But look, I think that if the exposure that you're going to get through the gut, the exposure you're going to get, again, to target that mucosal associated lymphatic tissue is the way that we're meant to be exposed to viral and bacterial antigens, not to mount the proper immune response, not having it bypass all of that and get injected directly into either the tissues or the bloodstream if you do it incorrectly, which apparently, according to Dr. John Campbell, there was significant evidence that a lot of people did it, frankly, pretty incorrectly, and doing it directly into the bloodstream during COVID. So, if they're not pulling back on the syringe after they push it in to make sure that they didn't hit a blood vessel, they're doing it wrong. And that goes for all of you who are in the healthcare professions. If you're not pulling back to make sure you didn't hit a blood vessel, you're doing it wrong. And I'm sure anybody who is a healthcare practitioner watching this show would do it right if they're doing vaccination at all. But if you are not doing it right, please start doing it right. Did I address that issue of you're going to have more likely to have more toxins in your food?
Yes.
I think that, yeah.
To be specific, the pediatrician said, if you're not eating holistically, then, you're going to find a lot more toxins in your foods.
Yeah.
And this mom in particular is holistically minded.
Well, that's great. And frankly, I wouldn't want the toxins that are in most people's food injected directly into my body either.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Just so we're clear, I'm going to pass on that. So in sum, the idea that suspending childhood vaccinations is going to result in this big catastrophe is a pharmaceutical industry fantasy. And it's used to justify the continuation of a very profitable, very liability-free product line. And the real world lived data suggests that childhood mortality will remain low. Long-term health outcomes might actually improve, chronic disease. Infectious disease outbreaks would be minimal in a well-nourished, well-sanitized population, which I think we've finally achieved after many millennia. And life expectancy, frankly, would remain stable or even increase if proper nutrition and public health measures were prioritized. So again, that's the big piece. We have to get the diet cleaned up. I think that's why RFK Jr. is starting there. It's like, let's get the nutrition cleaned up first, and then we'll have the groundwork, we'll have the foundation in place to be able to pull out some of the vaccination and still maintain the healthy outcomes. It's a genius plan. So like for those in the realm of the MAHA world, the Make America Healthy Again world, who are like, why isn't he going straight for vaccines? It's like, because the man has a plan, right? There's method to his madness. You have to get people replete with nutrients. You have to remove the toxins from the food supply first, so that when you back off on the vaccination, you don't get a massive surge in infectious disease. It makes perfect sense to me. Hopefully it's making more and more sense to you. So, but yeah, if we prioritize proper nutrition, we prioritize true public health measures, we're not going to see that life expectancy do anything more than increase. Worst case scenario probably would stay the same. But so yeah, at the end of the day, vaccines they're an industry, not a panacea. And they definitely do not deserve this unquestioned reverence that you see from so many circles, when history shows that true public health advancements were clean water, proper nutrition, sanitation. Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to acknowledge all the parents, all the moms and dads who are doing the critical thinking, who are asking questions, who are really being the first line of protection for their children, and for having the courage and the bravery to really stand up to what you once regarded as a really trusted authority. Yeah, that takes a lot. It really does. And there are options and resources for you, which I do want to cover on this episode
Oh,
because
yeah.
Cheryl asked about, so I'd love to hear about any or all of these topics: the history of vaccines in the pharmaceutical industry, the evolution of vaccine schedules, heavy metal content, resources for parents who want to know more about non-traditional routes. So I think over the measles episode and vaccinations and autism episode, we covered most of those questions.
Especially the vaccination and autism episode, we covered the history. We covered, I don't recall which episode it was that we talked about the evolution of the schedule, but I know that in at least one of the episodes, I showed the picture from CHD. I mean, I can go ahead and show that again real quick. I'm totally open to doing that. Yeah, this is such a great graphic because it's really more of a chart, but this is the CDC recommended schedule. And this is from children'shealthdefense.org, September 5th, 2019. CDC recommended vaccine schedule 1986 versus 2019. And you can see 1986, which is when the law was passed to make vaccines liability free. There were a total of 12 shots, 25 antigens, 8 diseases total. Now this is 2019, which is pre-COVID, 54 shots, 70 antigens, 16 diseases. My understanding is that's actually gone up now to 74 shots. And I don't recall how many antigens. I think it could be over 100, but don't quote me on that. And definitely more than 16 diseases. So been a huge expansion in the schedule. And what's fascinating is that when you start to see that autism rate really climb is like 3 years after. It's like 1989, right? So that's like when you would expect to see because autism is typically diagnosed around age 3, right? Two or three. So yeah. Interesting, right? So
other resources.
yeah, other resources that was the last part of her question.
Yes, for parents that are interested in non-traditional routes. I highly recommend visiting the website Just the Inserts. Alexandra has provided so much comprehensive information. She's also on Instagram, so Just the Inserts. And then reading.
So that site is just like JUST, the, and then inserts, INSERTS.
Correct.
Okay.
And reading the book.
And it's a reference to the inserts in the vaccine
Yes.
box, right? Okay, got it.
Yeah, you'll see every single one. You'll be able to research every single one.
Yeah, that's great. I used to go over those with my patients who came in for vaccine counseling. We would actually, and then also the CDC publishes vaccine information sheets that you're supposed to go over with the patient before you do the vaccination so they have informed consent. Nobody's doing this anymore. But it's funny, whenever I would do that and go over it with a patient, they would, to a person, choose not to get vaccinated. So it's ironic. It's like the more informed you are, I think really like skepticism of vaccines is directly proportional to how informed you are about vaccines. Like the more informed you are, the more skeptical you become. The less informed you are about what's in them and what the ingredients are and what they do and what the studies show, the more like, oh yeah, vaccines are safe and effective,
Yeah, so instead of operating out of fear, I invite you to come from a place of ease and calm and ask the questions. And here's another resource. She has a book called Well Considered. It's a handbook for making informed medical decisions. I also invite you to read Turtles All the Way Down, Vaccine, Science, and Myth. That one will blow your mind. just the first few chapters. And you're pulling up another resource, right?
Yeah, I was going to make a couple of suggestions, but Suzanne Humphrey's book, Dr. Suzanne Humphrey's book, Dissolving Illusions, is another good one, especially if you're interested in like the history of how this all went down, looking to see how we got from the early 1900s where we had famine, poverty, filth, eugenicist doctrine. There was a whole, it's really fascinating, the history of it. So if you're interested in the history of how we got here, if you're interested more in like the history of the corruption of the medical industry, there's a book called, it's called Rockefeller's Medicine Men. And it's a story of how Rockefeller Medicine Men. And that's the story of how medicine went from basically your doctor trying to figure out would help you in your individual health to making medicine an industry that was like a for-profit industry,
Yeah,
a
I mean, we could
capitalist
start
industry.
there if you want to.
Yeah.
How it started to come about.
Well, and be careful on turtles all the way down, because I've heard that there are, and let's take a look at this because we'll actually, so for those who are on YouTube, we'll be able to see
Yeah.
what I'm doing. So we'll look at Amazon here.
You're sharing, right? Okay.
I am sharing. So turtles all the way down. I heard that
There's another book called
there
that,
are
but
two books. So I'm actually looking to see. So this is the one that, yeah, Mary Holland JD. This is the correct one. And it really gets into the story such that it's one of those books that you can't read, you can't unread.
correct. And it is not the Turtles All the Way Down by John Green.
Yeah, it's not that one. Trying to see if there's the other one. I heard there was like a pro-vaccine book
Really?
that was called Turtles All the Way Down, that they actually like published it, but I don't know. I don't see that one right now. Yeah. I'm actually, yeah, I'm curious about that.
Tricky of them.
Well,
If that's true.
I don't know that that's true. So let's just take a look here. Yeah, I'm not really seeing it. So, hmm. Okay, well, maybe not. I don't know. That's a rumor I heard. So,
Okay.
all right, I can't find that one. So if there is a copycat book, then I can't find it. So yeah, at least not with a quick Amazon search. So yeah, other resources. I mentioned Moth and the Iron Lung, Children's Health Defense. If you live in Texas, Texans for Vaccine Choice. Oh, Physicians for Informed Consent is an excellent site. I have a colleague, I'll just share this. So if you go to naturopathicpediatrics.com, this was done, so this website is done by a colleague of mine. So this is meant to be like a resource for naturopathic pediatrics in general, but this self-paced online course, I would say this is probably the most unbiased course about vaccines and vaccination that I've been able to find. And it's, yeah, Erica Crumbeck. She's a naturopathic physician. She's the one who's the founder of this website. And the comment that she made is that she really started out to try to get to the truth of this, but then she said that the more research she did, the more she became skeptical of vaccines and vaccination. But that being said, she says here, I love this line. It says, "Vaccines will yeah, go ahead, go ahead."
Okay. Everybody can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, those on YouTube. But there's a porcupine with glasses on standing next to a stop sign with his hands on his hips. Vaccines are a touchy subject. Do not buy this course if you are not able to have an honest, kind, open, and thoughtful discussion about vaccines. If you have a very strong opinions, or if you have very strong opinions about vaccines already, this is probably not the course for you. Please do not buy it.
Right. I love that. Please do not buy it, because it shows you like she's really only interested in information. She's not interested in getting your money at the expense of your health or anything else, or your sanity or whatever. So yeah, so that's Vaccines Demystified. That's if you want a truly unbiased, someone who doesn't profit one way or the other. That's a really good course that you can take. And I think it's like $99, I want to say. She may have upped the price slightly. I don't know, but that's what it was last time I checked.
Mm.
I already closed it. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other resources that I think are really
I
great.
think that's
Dr. Sears's, all of Dr. Sears' books on attachment parenting, the baby book, the vaccine book. And frankly, he takes a very moderate approach. He's like, oh, here are the risks, here are the benefits potentially, here's what you could do to space them out. He presents you with a lot of options, and then you choose. And there's other good books out there. I wouldn't limit yourself to the ones we've talked about, but those are the ones that I think are the most current, more recent ones that are pretty well done. Anything else on that?
yes. Well,
Go ahead.
no. So,
Okay.
as we wrap up,
I can absolutely be complete with this topic. I think, well, I
Yes.
did want to say this.
Ah.
I still want to get into the question of which vaccines actually reduce the risk of all-cause mortality, which ones actually help you live longer and extend your lifespan. But we're not going to go straight
Oh
to
my
that.
gosh,
We're going to take a break
yes,
because we're vaccinated up and vaccinated
Vaccine
out at
out.
this point. And we really want to take a break from this topic. We will come back to that eventually, but right now we're interested in talking about something completely different.
yeah, it's funny because it has some of our friends, one beloved friend, say to me, I'm halfway through the measles podcast. You're an angel for how much patience you have.
Yeah, that's one of the big problems with these is like it's a lot of me talking.
Well, this is the thing. So I want to acknowledge myself,
I know
not only for patients, but also for the training and development over the years of masterful listening. Because, and I think it's really attributed to my overall health and wellness to be able to concentrate and to masterfully listen, except for the soap moment where I was distracted by the dog barking. But it takes that kind of intentional listening to really, okay, how am I going to respond to you or to share my thoughts on this? And you are absolutely the expert. And I'm a mother. And I'm a practice manager of a medical practice, Aspen Wellness Institute. And for myself, I practice so many things that are dedicated to and committed to optimizing my health and wellness. I'm on a very committed genotype diet. I take my nutraceuticals, my food-derived
every day,
medicine every
wants to or
day.
not. I'll
Right.
acknowledge you for all those things.
Yes, I move my body intentionally. I exercise.
More than me. That's not saying much. I'm my own worst patient. I'll leave it at that.
That will transform, husband.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So there is a kind of, how do you say, this unique perspective that I have to contribute to the world and to moms and dads and to children. All right.
Well, and I acknowledge you for holding the space, and I acknowledge you for also being the representative of each and every one of those people here with me. Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Partovi Effect.
I'm Dr. Ryan Partovi.
And I am Mrs. Madi Partovi.
Be well.